Hi, friends. I want to spend a few minutes speaking with you about the critical relationship between servant ministry and a deep dive spirituality. One of Jesus's most memorable teachings on what it means to be a servant is found in Mark chapter 10, and it can be potentially misleading if we're not careful. Let's listen to that text. It's Mark chapter 10, 43 to 45, and it's a great passage. The disciples are disputing over who's the greatest. And as always, Jesus comes in with a deep insight and he tells them, but it's not so among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. But there's a danger here if we don't look at how Jesus modeled servant ministry and giving himself away and being a slave. Because if we look elsewhere in the gospel, it's really interesting. Jesus wasn't actually engaged in servant ministry 24/7. He regularly, and you can see this from the opening chapters of Mark, he regularly pulled away and went to deserted places so that he could practice silence and solitude. And what was he doing there? He was working on his own spiritual formation, essentially as a precondition for being able to serve others and give himself away. And then Jesus didn't jump on airplanes to go around and speak, or jump in the car, or even jump on a Zoom call so he could have instantaneous access. Jesus was essentially walking around, and he was walking around with his disciples. So not only did he spend large blocks of time in silence and solitude preparing for ministry, on the way to do ministry, and often he was interrupted while he was walking around, you could imagine he's really engaged in group communal spiritual formation with his own disciples. So we need to think about that really carefully. And so, how are you preparing yourself for ministry? Because the danger is to take on the role of servant apart from our true identity, which is men and women deeply loved by God. Our true self is found in Christ. And so if we're going to take on the role of servant, make sure that's not your identity, because our identity are people rooted deeply in God's grace, not simply servants to everybody else. It's kind of like on the airlines, and this is that cliche, but they always tell us, put on your own mask first before you help somebody around you. One of my favorite spiritual leaders from the medieval period was Bernard of Clairvaux. And Bernard has a fantastic metaphor for what I'm trying to talk about in his sermon number 18 on the Song of Songs. He talks about the goal is to be ministers who take on the metaphor of being reservoirs over against ministers who function as a canal. And so what was Bernard getting at? Well, what's a reservoir? A reservoir is obviously a body of water that holds water, whose whole purpose is to provide water for other people. That's the perfect picture of what a true servant is. But here's the thing. For Clairvaux, for Bernard of Clairvaux, a reservoir only gave of itself out of the overflow of grace and transformation that God had already filled it with. So it had a spring that allowed it then to flow out. So if we're going to serve as reservoirs, we need to make sure that we're deeply rooted in Christ, that we're practicing the means of grace, that we're in communal missional formation practices. Again, as that kind of that precondition for being the servants that a text like Mark 10 calls us to become. Because the danger is that we function more as canals. Yeah, we want to be servants, but what's a canal? Well, in Bernard Clairvaux's day, a canal was essentially a channel that only had water flowing in it after a storm. And essentially the water goes into the canal and it flows right through. A modern day example, especially live in a city, would be to be a minister as though you were a storm sewer. In other words, every single drop of water that comes into you just immediately flows out to someone else. Now, if we do ministry that way, if we do ministry as canals or as storm sewers, we're going to always be completely depleted. And what that leads to in ministry is burnout, a sense of overwhelm. Sometimes we can feel like our calling by Jesus is a burden rather than a gift and a true calling that calls us to bring our best self to that. So take a look at yourself. Even right now, are you just feeling exhausted? Are you burned out? Because remember, the Jesus who says, be a slave of all, also talks about in Matthew of having an easy and light yoke. And if you're burdened and heavy laden, you're supposed to come to Jesus. And when you come to Jesus and we plug in to the abundance of God's love for us and deeply root ourselves in formational practices, then we can be reservoirs and we serve the world and we literally allow ourselves to be poured out over the overflow of what God's done in our lives. So friends, yeah, we want to embrace servant ministry. We want to give ourselves away. We want to transform the world with the power of the gospel, with the good news of the kingdom. But that's only going to happen when we root ourselves in a deep dive spiritual formation. Thanks so much for the opportunity to share a little bit about the relationship between servanthood and spiritual formation. And my prayer for you today is that you would be astonished anew by the love and the grace of God. And out of that connection, out of that true identity, that you would then take the gospel to the ends of the earth and work with God, co-labor with God who goes before us to manifest the kingdom even in our day.